Hi everyone, I'm Tobias Smith. I'm from the University of Queensland. I'm speaking to you from Queensland. Actually, I'm speaking to you from my home, which is on the country of the Yugambeh language group, which is the Gold Coast and areas around the Gold Coast. I'm on the southern Gold Coast. So today I'm going to talk to you about native bees. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of native bee diversity in general, and then I'm going to move into one particularly fascinating group, the native stingless bees, which have great relevance for us as beekeepers because they're the native bees that you can keep and manage in hives, much like you would with European honeybees, although there's some important differences as well as some similarities. I'll get to those. First though, bee diversity, global bee diversity. So we know that there are at least 20,500 different bee species in the world. Now, these are the ones that have been discovered and described by science, and this number is constantly going up, and we think that there's probably 25, maybe even 30,000 bee species on the planet. And you can see from some of the appearances of these bees on the screen that there is amazing diversity in appearances, in lifestyles, in levels of sociality, and all sorts of things in the bees of the world. There are lifetimes getting to know the bees of the world. Here in Australia, though, we have at least 1,660. So these are, again, the number of species that have been formally described by science and given names. But this number is also going up because people are discovering new bee species still in Australia. And we think probably that there's about 2,000, maybe something like 2,500 bee species for a maximum in Australia. So many still to be discovered. And again, look at that diversity of appearances, and we've got that diversity of lifestyles as well. Now, I mentioned before this diversity in levels of sociality. So I'm sure that most of you bee lovers already know this, but you've got those really highly social bees like European honeybees that live in big complex colonies having a queen. And then you've got solitary bees, bees that live all by themselves, don't live with other bees, don't help other bees. They live by themselves. They make their own nests. They raise their own babies independently. Now, these are two ends of a scale of sociality, in fact, the truly solitary bees at one end and the highly eusocial bees at the other. But there are elements of semi-sociality within the world of bees that you find with different species. And as I go through a few individual bee species here in Australia, I'm going to get that scale across to you with some examples. So let's start at the bottom with a truly solitary bee, a blue-banded bee. Now, I'm sure probably everyone, I hope everyone who's listening has come across blue-banded bees before. There's a number of different species in this Amygdala group that we call blue-banded bees. There are also others which look like this but don't have blue bands, other banded bees. But you'll find these blue-banded bees all around Australia. Now, as truly solitary bees, these are females in the picture. Females have 4 blue stripes, males have 5 blue stripes. They nest by themselves underground. So they actually dig a short tunnel, which might be something like 10 to 15 centimeters deep. And down the bottom, they excavate a series of brood cells, so little hollows where they will raise their babies individually. And you can see from this picture, 5 brood cells that have been excavated by the photographer, showing 5 provisions of food, so pollen and nectar mixed in that ball. That's the orange stuff. And then on the bottom left there, you can see an egg that's been laid. And then in the others, you can see various sized larvae. The eggs have hatched and the larvae are then consuming that food. Now, this is not a blue-banded bee's nest, but it's one very similar to blue-banded bees. A blue-banded bee mother will do all this by herself, provision these cells, and then die of exhaustion before these offspring become adults. And in her life, which might only be a few weeks, she might provision maybe something like 20, 25, maybe even 30 offspring during that time. And that's it. She's not there to see the next generation thrive and do it all again. There's no overlap of generations. So this is a truly solitary bee. And most bees in the world, like this, nest underground. 70% of the world's bees. And 75% of the world's bees are truly solitary, like this. So that's the bottom end of this scale of sociality, really common group of bees. A little step up the scale of sociality, getting towards those highly eusocial bees, we've got communal bees. Now, these emerald homolictus, these are about 4 millimeters long, beautiful little bees, also nest underground. But what makes them different to the truly solitary bees is that you'll get multiple related females sharing a nest together. Now, they're not like European honeybees or stingless bees. They're not all helping each other. There's not a queen. They're not storing honey. They're individuals sharing the same nest, but doing their own thing. So I like to think of these as the flatmate bees. They're flatmates, females, sisters sometimes, nesting together and all doing their own thing, but just sharing the front door, the tunnel up and out of the ground. And sometimes you'll get them in one tunnel by itself, but sometimes these bees will nest in the same area. We call this an aggregation. So lots of bees with individual nests nesting near each other because the soil's appropriate, or over the years, the daughters from nests decide to nest nearby, and you get this dense aggregation sometimes, which is amazing to see. It's this hive of activity, but they're either solitary bees or communal bees. They're not all there collaborating. Let's go one more step up the scale of sociality to semi-social behaviour. And a nice example of semi-social bees in Australia are the carpenter bees. So these are our biggest bees. These are Xylocopa coptortisoma, the great carpenter bees. The females are yellow and black, hairy. The male, that golden green one there, that's a male. Now these bees, they're not nesting underground, so sort of unusual for one of the bees of the world. They, as the name suggests, carpenter bees, they chew holes in wood, in dead wood. So these bees need dead branches and things in trees. They make a little hole that you might be able to stick your thumb in, that kind of diameter, and then she hollows it out, the mother, and she raises her babies in there, just a few, maybe 6 to 8 babies at a time. And you might think, well, this sounds like a solitary bee. She's doing this all by herself. But what makes this bee a semi-social bee, not a truly solitary bee, is that these females can live for a long time. And she'll be there still as an adult, alive, when her offspring go through all those stages of growing and become adults themselves. So you get this overlap of generations, adult mothers and adult children knowing each other and in the nest persisting together at the same time. This is a form of semi-sociality. But they're a lot like solitary bees. It's still a very small scale when we compare it to the highly eusocial bees, which we're getting to. For those of you in New South Wales and down around the Hunter region, and in Sydney, anyone down that way as well, you will be fairly commonly delighted if you're out in some natural environments to see some green carpenter bees. So these are slightly smaller than the great carpenter bees. They're also nesting in wood. They're chewing holes in wood. Often different types of wood. Sometimes you'll see these bees in grass tree flowering stalk stems. So when the flowering stalk was dried off, they'll chew into the pithy center. Sometimes Banksias and things like that as well. Now, these bees are worthy of a mention because these two species are actually thought to be extinct in mainland South Australia and in Victoria, where they were once found. So we don't know a great deal about the conservation status of Australian bees because not enough data has been collected over time to look for declines. But for these big charismatic bees, we do know, and they've been lost for them from those areas. So those of you who see these bees should consider yourself very lucky. And I've seen plenty of them in the Hunter Valley. So get out there and look. All right, highly eusocial bees, the bees that we're all here to talk about, really, the ones we can keep in boxes. So highly eusocial, just like European honeybees, they've got castes, so queens, workers, the daughters of the queen, the drones, the males. They cooperatively care for the offspring, so they're collaboratively working in these perennial colonies. They're going on and on and on. It's often obviously a turnover of bees within that colony, but as a single reproductive unit, it's perennial and ongoing. Now, globally, these are the only two groups, the honeybees, of which there's about 10 species, and the stingless bees, of which there are hundreds of species. I'll get to that soon. You probably have heard the term apiculture and apiarist, someone who keeps apis bees, honeybees, Apis mellifera. Us stingless beekeepers are not called apiarists, we're called meloponists because we keep bees of the Melaponini tribe of bees, the stingless bees. So keeping them, a place where you keep them is a meloponary. The practice is meloponiculture. So different terms. I'm not an apiarist. I once was, but I'm not anymore. I'm a keeper of Melaponini bees. Diversity. So there's about 600 stingless bee species in the world. So here it's just a few from Australia and from South America. The middle one obviously is Apis mellifera, a European honeybee, just for size context. So these are all relative to one another in scale. You can see the biggest one, top left there, Melipona, bigger than a honeybee. These are from South America, big, impressive stingless bees. Make a lot more honey than ours here make. Below that, you can see one of the smallest in the world, just a couple of millimeters long, Tetragonula. And then below that, the next three along the bottom there, those are some of our Australian stingless bees. So the world of stingless bees is very, very cool. Now, some similarities and some differences. They're both highly used social groups, the honeybees and the stingless bees. You'll be familiar with this hexagonal comb made of wax, used by honeybees to store both their food, then their honey and their pollen and their brood. You can see in the picture below there with the queen, she's walking on brood comb. This is very different to what we see inside a stingless bee nest. When we look inside a stingless bee nest, it looks like this. In the middle, we've got the brood cells. So these are very small balls. Each of those has a developing bee inside it. And different to the honeybees, which have the same sorts of cells to store their food and their brood, stingless bees have different structures. So around the sides there, those bigger balls you can see, those are the food storage pots, the honey pots and the pollen pots, and then all of that connective tissue that they make, connective structures that they use to hold it all together. Now, another difference here is this is all dark in color. It's not light, it's not that waxy color that you see in honeybees. That's because stingless bees don't use pure wax for all of this. They use propolis. So they go out and they gather resins from trees, tree sap, they bring it home, they mix it with beeswax, which they make like honeybees. That's propolis, everything gets built out of that. And that's got important factors that influence things like the flavor of the honey, but we'll get to that later. Let's have a closer look at the honey pots. So here's one that's still under construction. You can see a bee poking her head out of it. These are about the size of little grapes. You can see the rest around there are capped and closed, little sweet, delicious grapes of honey. Here's another look at that brood. So each of the brood cells, so differently to European honeybees, which leave their brood cells open while the egg is there and then it hatches into the larvae and they progressively feed that larvae as it grows, leaving the cell uncapped. Stingless bees cap their brood from day one. They put all of the food into that cell that baby bee will need to grow. Then the queen lays an egg on top, then they close it. It stays closed for the entire development. So we don't have this progressive provisioning that we see in European honeybees. We have mass provisioning. And in fact, European honeybees are pretty weird in the world of bees because there's very few bees in the world that progressively provision. Most bees, I'd like to say something like 97 or 98% of the world's bees, approximately, mass provision like this. The baby gets all the food it needs from day one. Here's the queen. So like European honeybees, there's only a single queen in our Australian stingless bees. She is much bigger than the others because she's full of ovaries that are growing eggs, and she'll lay for the main group of stingless bees that we've got here in Australia, the Tetragonula bees, about 300 to 400 eggs per day. This is actually not a Tetragonula queen, but that doesn't matter. They look very similar. This is the other group, Austroplebia, that we have. But a queen, we think, will live between about 1 and 4 years, and then she will need to be replaced. She'll die of natural causes, or she'll die of attack from another colony, or she'll die of attack from her daughters if she's not doing a good enough job. All of that's another story. So they need new queens, and those start as virgin queens, princesses, like European honeybees. But again, the difference, because of the way that they grow young bees with these mass provision cells, it's a bit different to honeybees. So you can see right in the center of the picture there, that much bigger brood cell, that's got a developing virgin queen, a princess inside it. So the only difference between a worker female and a princess female is the amount of food that she's fed as a larvae. It's not different food, it's the same food, but in a much bigger brood cell like that, she gets fed much more and she grows bigger, and her ovaries don't degenerate as they do in the worker bees. So she has the capacity to become a queen and to lay eggs. Worker stingless bees don't lay eggs in these ones, the main ones, Tetragonula, that we have here in Australia. Now, when she comes out, she looks like this. Here's a princess, a lot like a queen, but not as big. She's quite a fast walker. Now, the process of going from a princess to a queen like this is a whole story in itself. It's dramatic and interesting. So a queen can live between 1 and 4 years, remember. Princesses, on average, no one's actually measured this, but it seems that they probably produce something like 1 per week on average as a backup. But if a queen lives between 1 and 4 years, they don't need all of those backups, 50-something backups a year, probably. So what happens to those? Well, they seem to get tolerated for a little while, and then at some point in their development, after a few weeks, if they're not needed, they get the chop. The bees surround them, hold them with their mandibles, and pull them apart or resin them up or do something else that's nasty to kill them. Some of them might sneak out and try and go and requeen queenless colonies elsewhere, but that's not something that's very well understood either. So basically, being a princess is not very good unless you're the lucky one that happened to be there at the right time. And if you are, you need to mate with a male bee, unlike European honeybees who can mate with multiple male bees. The queen, a stingless bee queen, will only mate with one single male, which she'll do outside the nest. The boys will be out there waiting for her. She'll mate with one. She'll come back inside. Her abdomen will swell with egg production like this, and she'll never leave the nest again. She becomes an egg-laying slave to the workers for the rest of her days. Okay, let's move on. Here in Australia, we've got the two groups I mentioned. We've got the Tetragonula stingless bees and the Austroplebia bees, and you can see that they've got these different ranges. Tetragonula are the ones that you tend to find closer to the coast, and for those of you in Newcastle, Tetragonula are all you've got. You've got Tetragonula carbonaria, and then further south of you, if you go a little bit north of Newcastle, you'll start to see Austroplebia, one species of Austroplebia australis. Up here on the Gold Coast, we've got 3 native stingless bee species, and we see another one as we go up to Brisbane. These two groups, the bees look remarkably similar to one another until you get intimately familiar with them. But when you look inside the nest, their brood, the babies, looks different. And you can see this really nice layered pattern to the Tetragonula brood there, whereas the Austroplebia don't have such a layered, they have what we call cluster brood. So the brood cells kind of all on each other in a spherical ball, not these distinct layers. So a very obvious thing once you see inside the nest. Now, most people who keep these bees in boxes keep Tetragonula. Austroplebia is kept, and in certain areas it's kept a lot, but on the most part, it's Tetragonula. Remember, meliponiculture, the keeping of stingless bees. On the left here, a nice little box somebody's keeping in an urban garden with Tetragonula bees, and on the right, some stingless bees being kept on a macadamia farm. I'll talk about pollination soon. These bees, the keeping of stingless bees is growing enormously. It's mostly driven by people who want to keep these bees as pets, but we're starting to see a lot of growth in this area of crop pollination as well, and people starting to keep them for interest in gathering the healthy honey that these bees produced, and some people with eyes to one day be selling this honey. We'll talk about the honey. How do most people propagate these bees? Well, it's usually you get boxes that are designed in such a way that they can be physically divided. The box on the right here is full with a nest. You get another empty box, and when the box is full and certain things are right, there's lots of rules about it, but when it's all right, you can literally chop it in half. You're getting brood, you're getting bees, you're getting food, and you're coupling each half with a new empty box, and you're left with 2. Much like European honeybee keepers will do as well, with frames, taking them out, brood frames and things. But with this, we don't take the contents out, we take the box itself so that we don't do as much damage to the inner contents. There are other ways to propagate these bees, but this is, for the most part, the way that it's usually done. And then you've got 2 hives. And the next year you've got 4, and the next year you've got 8, and it goes on. Before you know it, you're obsessed and you've got too many hives. We, like European honeybee keepers, have to think about how we position our bees, because bees are central place foragers. So they always come back to a place where they live and they orientate to the landscape. So if you've got a beehive that sits in one spot and you move it to a different spot that's close by, the bees will recognize the landscape, do their thing, and fly back to the old spot. So we have to consider those things, just like honeybee keepers. We have to consider something else too, that our bees have a propensity to fight with one another. So we can't just go and lump 7 beehives together like this who don't know each other and think everything will be fine, because they'll fight with each other. We get to situations like this in the picture by starting with one, 12 months later splitting it and having two, leaving them side by side, the next year splitting again. And because these colonies are always together, they've got this constant familiarity. They don't fight. They get used to each other. They stay used to each other. Now, fighting can happen as a beekeeper making a mistake of putting two hives that don't know each other together, or it can happen naturally because these bees, one of the ways that they start new colonies is by exploring the landscape and either finding an empty nest site, a hollow tree somewhere, and spending a long time, about 6 months, to slowly establish a new nest, differently to European honeybees. The alternative is, instead of looking for an empty nest site, just go and find a full nest site, find another colony of stingless bees that you think's weaker than yourself and kill them all and move in. And most stingless beekeepers will see this eventually. It's very dramatic. You get this big swarm of bees outside a hive, lots of bees falling to the ground in pairs and dying. So attackers attacking, defenders coming out, catching each other in the air, falling to the ground, killing one another. And the winner is the colony that has the most bees to sacrifice. And if that's the attackers, the rest of them move in, kill the queen, kill all the adult bees, take it over, bring in their own princess, enslave the baby bees, and there you go. In a few days, you've got this whole colony that's got food, it's got bees, slave workers, it's got everything you need. You don't have to have this long process of establishing a new nest. Very cool stuff, but we need to move on to crop pollination. These are the crops that we know stingless bees can pollinate. So those with the green smiley faces, macadamia, blueberry, and avocado in particular, stingless bees are effective pollinators of these crops, and growers of these crops use stingless bees as managed pollinators. The others there too are less commonly used by stingless bees, are less commonly managed in these crops, but interest in stingless bees is growing, and I'm sure that they're going to be following, and this is going to be becoming more of a common thing in these crops and other crops as well, no doubt. Honey. So stingless bees gather nectar, just like honeybees do. They concentrate that nectar into honey. And you can see on the left, this bee with this big full abdomen swollen of nectar flying home, and on the right, a bee that's not flying home with nectar, so you can see how much they can hold inside. They do the same thing as honeybees. They repeatedly regurgitate and evaporate off water, turn it into honey. And we know a bit about stingless bee honey. We know that it's very different to honeybee honey. It's more watery. It's got these strong flavors. It's got this sharpness to it. It's got this citrusy tang. And very recently, work from the University of Queensland has shown that it's also got something else that's very special. This sugar called trihellulose. So you've got your glucoses, your fructoses, your sucroses. Trihellulose is another one of those sugars. And the dominant sugar in Australian Tetragonula stingless bee honey is trihellulose. Now, that's exciting because trihellulose is low GI. Trihellulose, the bacteria that causes tooth decay, doesn't grow in trihellulose. So it is genuinely this healthy honey. And we're beginning to understand more and more about this with ongoing work at the University of Queensland. And I think watch this space, because you've heard of Manuka. One day you'll be reading all about stingless bee honey and the health benefits that it has too. Something else about stingless bee honey, apart from having trihellulose in it, is these other qualities that you get from the way that it's stored. Honeybees storing their honey in these wax cells. Wax has no flavor. Wax has no chemistry really that infuses into the honey. So you're just getting the taste of the nectars in honeybee honey. In stingless bee honey, they're storing that honey in these propolis pots, wax and tree resins. Those tree resins infuse flavor. So you get this very typical tang, this bite, this tartness to it when you eat a stingless bee honey that comes from that. They also infuse chemicals, antimicrobial chemicals. And we think that some of the other health benefits that probably come from stingless bee honey, such as potentially antimicrobial qualities. These sorts of tests have been done in the lab looking at antimicrobial qualities, and this honey is very good. And we think probably some of that comes from these chemicals infusing from the resin. So again, watch this space. There's so much that we still need to learn about stingless bee honey. You can't really buy it in shops yet, but you will be able to one day, and it's going to be remarkable when it happens. I'm done. That was a crash course on native bees. I'm going to finish by saying that at the moment, those of you in Newcastle and the Hunter are not traveling. I'm very sorry. I hope you're all going well with your lockdowns, tolerating your lockdowns. But when travel can happen again, we offer native bee workshops at the University of Queensland. In particular, those worth travelling for are the identification courses that we run. They're on this year, you can't come, but next year, maybe you'll be able to come, they'll be happening again. So watch this space if you're interested in bee identification in general and the skills you need to know to do that. Thanks very much. Enjoy the day of online talks. See ya.